The moment I heard my daughter-in-law's voice through the kitchen wall, I stopped breathing. I had let myself in through the back door the way I always did on Sunday mornings, my key, my house, the same house I had lived in for 31 years before I signed it over to my son. I had a pot of soup in my hands and a bag of groceries hanging from my elbow, and I was already calling out a hello when I heard her say his name in that low, flat tone she used when she thought no one else was listening. "She's 64, not 90, my daughter-in-law said. And frankly, at the rate she's going, we'll be stuck dealing with her for another 20 years. I'm not doing 20 more years of this." I stood very still in the hallway. The linoleum under my feet was the same linoleum I had chosen at the hardware store in 1993. The small ivory squares with the thin blue border. I had laid it myself with my late husband on a Saturday in October, and we had argued cheerfully about which direction to start from the center of the room. "She's fine," my son said. His voice was quieter, careful, the voice he used when he was trying to keep peace rather than speak truth. "She is not fine. She showed up here 3 times last week. 3 times. She rearranged my pantry. She told my son his shoes were on the wrong feet. He's 7. He can figure out his own shoes." A pause. "And the money isn't going to last forever. Your salary isn't going to cover this mortgage plus her little monthly contribution once I leave my job. You know that. You're not leaving your job. I might want to. I might want to be home with the kids when we have a second one. And we can't do any of that with her hovering around and her money tied up in whatever she feels like giving us that month." Another pause, longer this time. "There are very nice places, you know, for her age. We wouldn't have to put her somewhere terrible, just somewhere managed." I set the soup pot down on the hallway table as carefully as I could. My hands were shaking slightly, which surprised me. I had spent 30 years as a registered nurse. I had held the hands of people in the worst moments of their lives without shaking. But hearing your own son say nothing, absolutely nothing, while his wife described putting you in a facility so she could have your house and your money and your quiet removal from the picture, that shook something loose in me that I hadn't known was still attached. I picked up my grocery bag and my pot of soup, and I walked back out the door I had come in through. I locked it behind me. I sat in my car in their driveway for 2 full minutes, and I made a decision. My name is Dorothy. I am 64 years old, and until that Sunday morning, I had believed with my whole heart that the greatest thing I could do for my son was to make his life easier. I want to be fair to myself when I tell this story, because I know how it sounds from the outside. I know that women my age who give and give and give are sometimes described as foolish, as naive, as asking for it. I've heard people say that parents who enable their adult children have no one to blame but themselves. Maybe there's truth in that, but I want you to understand what I was actually thinking, because I don't think I was foolish. I think I was a mother who loved her son so much that she confused love with rescue. My husband passed away 14 years ago. Our son was 22 at the time, just out of college, just starting to figure out who he was. When his father died, something in him went soft in a way that never quite hardened back up. He was never irresponsible, not exactly. He worked. He paid his own bills for a few years. He was a decent young man, but he had a hole in him after his father died, the kind of hole that certain people can find and pour themselves into, and my daughter-in-law was very good at finding it. She was charming when I first met her. I want to be honest about that too, because she wasn't a villain from the first moment. She was quick and funny, and she made my son laugh in a way I hadn't seen him laugh since before his father got sick. I liked her. I wanted to like her. And when they got married and they asked if they could move into my house while they saved for their own place, I said yes immediately, because of course I did. It was my son, it was my house. What else would I say? The while they saved became 2 years, then 4, then 7. By the time I started to understand the shape of what was happening, I was already in it, up to my neck. What happened was gradual enough that I never saw a clear line to step back over. I started paying the heating bill because it was a cold winter and they had a new baby and my daughter-in-law had just stopped working. I started paying the property taxes because my son had a rough quarter at work and I didn't want them to fall behind. I started doing their grocery run every Sunday because it was something I could do, something tangible, something that felt like love in the form of action. And somewhere in all of that, without any single conversation where I agreed to it, I became the financial floor beneath their lives. I was paying approximately $3,000 a month into their household by the time that Sunday morning arrived, on top of the fact that they were living in my house, the house I had transferred into my son's name 5 years earlier at his request because he said it would help with his mortgage application. That was the part that kept me awake that night after I got home. The house. I had signed that house over to him because he asked, and because I trusted him, and because I was his mother, and I thought that was what a good mother did. I had not thought carefully about what it meant for me. I had not consulted a lawyer. I had not asked what would happen if things changed. I had just signed. I am a registered nurse. I am not an uneducated woman. I spent 32 years making careful, precise decisions under pressure, and I signed my house away to my son and his wife without a second thought because I loved him. That Monday morning, I called my attorney. Her name is Patricia, and she has been my attorney for 20 years. And she has the particular quality of delivering bad news in a calm, factual tone that I have always found more comforting than false reassurance. She did not react dramatically when I explained what I had overheard. She said, "Tell me the exact timeline of the transfer." I told her. She asked me several more questions, and I answered all of them. And at the end she said, "There may be options. Come in Tuesday." I went in Tuesday. What Patricia explained to me over the course of an hour and a half was this. The house transfer had been made as a gift, which meant in most circumstances it was final. However, she had identified 2 potential angles worth exploring. The first was that at the time of the transfer, I had signed a document my son had presented to me quickly, as part of the larger paperwork that included language about my right of residency. I had not read it carefully. Patricia had read it very carefully, and she believed that language could be interpreted as creating an ongoing obligation on my son's part, one that arguably had already been violated by the conversation I had described. The second angle was that the transfer had occurred during a period when I was briefly, as Patricia delicately put it, not receiving independent legal advice. She thought there might be grounds to challenge it. Neither option was guaranteed. Both would take time. Both would require me to make a decision about what I actually wanted. "Do you want the house back?" Patricia asked me. I thought about it for a long moment. I thought about the ivory linoleum. I thought about my husband on his knees in the kitchen, arguing cheerfully with me about where to start from the center. "I want my son to understand what he's about to lose," I said. "And I want to still be his mother when this is over." Patricia nodded and said she would start making calls. In the meantime, I did something that I think surprised even me. I stopped. I simply stopped. I did not show up on Sunday with groceries. I did not transfer my regular contribution to their account on the 1st of the month. I did not answer the phone when my daughter-in-law called to ask if I could watch my grandson on Thursday because she had plans. I answered a text from my son 2 days later that said, "Mom, everything okay?" With "Everything is fine, honey. Just taking a little time for myself." And that was all. I want to tell you that the silence felt powerful and intentional, and in some ways, it did. But I also want to be honest and tell you that it felt like grief. I had organized so much of my daily life around the architecture of their needs that when I stopped filling it in, I didn't know quite what shape my own life was supposed to be. I called my friend Cecilia and cried on her couch for about an hour on a Wednesday afternoon, and she handed me tissues and told me that I had always been the kind of person who confused being needed with being loved, and I said I knew, and she said the fact that I knew it didn't mean I had fixed it yet, and I said I knew that too. By the second week, my son was calling more frequently. By the third week, he drove to my apartment. I had rented a small apartment in the same neighborhood 2 years ago, partly to give them space, and partly because I missed having a place that was just mine, and knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, and I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw how tired he was. Not the tired of someone who had been wronged, the tired of someone who had been going along with something for so long that he had forgotten it was a choice. He said, "The mortgage payment came out and there wasn't enough in the account." "I know," I said. "Mom, how much do you know about what your wife has been planning?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "What do you mean?" I told him what I had heard. Not with anger. I had moved through the anger in the weeks since, partly at Patricia's office, partly on Cecilia's couch, partly on long walks through the park near my apartment at 6 in the morning when the light was just coming up through the trees and I had to keep moving or I would stop. I told him the way I would explain a diagnosis to a patient's family, clearly and completely, and without softening the parts that needed to be heard. My son was quiet for a very long time after I finished. She was just frustrated, he said finally. He said it the way people say things they don't entirely believe, like a prayer they've repeated so many times the words have come apart from the meaning. Maybe, I said, but frustrated people say things they mean. And what she said was very specific. She said 20 more years. She said managed care. She said the money isn't going to last forever and she wants to be done with it. I paused. She's been thinking about this for a while. That's not a frustrated comment. That's a plan. He put his hands over his face. He sat like that for almost a minute. I didn't know she felt that way, he said. And the terrible thing was that I believed him. Not entirely, I believed. He had noticed things and chosen not to look at them directly, the way you can choose not to look at something if you're afraid of what it is. But I believed he had not known the full shape of it. And that was its own kind of painful thing to sit with, the understanding that my son had become someone who didn't know his own household. What do you want to do? He asked. I want to stop, I said. I want to stop being the foundation of a house that I don't live in. I want you to figure out how to support your own family. Because you can, you're capable of it, and the reason you haven't had to is because I have always been right there to catch you before you had to find out. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. I love you. I have loved you your whole life and I will love you until I am gone. But I am not a backup account. I am your mother. And those two things have gotten confused somewhere along the way, and I think that's my fault as much as it's anyone else's. He looked at me and his eyes were wet and he said, What about the house? Patricia is looking into it, I said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I want my options explained to me. What happens after that depends on a lot of things, including this conversation and however many conversations come after it. He nodded. He didn't argue. That was the moment I understood that some part of my son, the part that remembered his father, that remembered who our family had been before it got rearranged into this shape, that part had been waiting for someone to say this out loud. My daughter-in-law called me that evening. Her voice was a register lower than usual, which was the voice she used when she was deciding to be reasonable. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said. I don't think there has, I said. Dorothy. You can call me that, I said. But I want you to hear me clearly. So I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to say it plainly. I love my son. I love my grandson. I am not going anywhere, not to a facility, not out of their lives, not into some quiet corner where I stop being inconvenient. What I am doing is stopping the financial support, effective immediately, because it should have stopped a long time ago, and I am the one who let it continue, and that was a mistake I am correcting now. I paused. I hope we can have a different kind of relationship going forward, but that is up to you. She hung up. My grandson called me that night, or rather, my son handed him the phone because my grandson was 7 and didn't make his own calls. And my grandson said, Grandma, are you coming to my baseball game on Saturday? And I said, Of course I am, baby. I wouldn't miss it. And he said, Good, because I hit a double last time and I'm going to do it again. And I said, I believe you completely, and I meant both of those things with everything I had. The following weeks were not simple. I want to be clear about that, because stories like mine sometimes get told as if the moment of standing up is the end of the story, and it isn't. The moment of standing up is just the beginning of the harder work. My daughter-in-law spent about 2 weeks cycling through different approaches, cold silence, then sudden warmth, then pointed comments about how difficult things were without my help, then a conversation where she said she hadn't meant what she said and I had misunderstood the tone. I listened to most of it without responding much. Patricia had advised me not to have substantive conversations about the house until we had a clearer picture of our options, and I followed that advice carefully. My son, in the meantime, was doing something I had not expected. He was waking up. I don't know exactly what happened inside his marriage during those weeks. He didn't tell me everything, and I didn't ask, because he is a grown man and his marriage is his own even when it causes me pain. But I saw the effects of it. He picked up a second consulting project. He called me more. And the calls were different, less about logistics and money, more about actual conversation. the way we used to talk before everything became about what I could provide. He came to the baseball game and sat next to me in the bleachers, and we watched my grandson sprint around the bases, and we both cheered too loudly, and I thought about my husband, and I thought about how much he would have loved this exact moment, this ordinary Saturday afternoon, and I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for a very long time. Patricia called me 6 weeks after our initial meeting with an update. The right of residency language in the original transfer document was, in her assessment, strong enough to pursue. She had also spoken to a colleague who specialized in elder law and undue influence claims. And while the case was not airtight, it was not weak either. She walked me through my options carefully. I could pursue a challenge to the transfer, which would take time and money and would certainly fracture my relationship with my son, regardless of the outcome. I could negotiate a formal agreement using the residency language as leverage, which would give me legally documented protections without having to undo the transfer. Or I could continue as things were and rely on my relationship with my son rather than legal documentation. I thought about it for 3 days. I called Patricia and told her I wanted option 2, a formal agreement, legally documented, that established my right to return to the house if I chose, that required any sale or transfer of the property to include my written consent, and that created a clear written record of what had been given and what had not. Not a clawback of the house, not a battle. A boundary, written down in language that didn't depend on anyone's goodwill to enforce. I told my son about it on a Tuesday evening. I brought it to him as a finished document, not as a negotiation, because Patricia had advised me not to make it a negotiation, and she was right. I explained what it was and why I wanted it. My son read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have made sure you had something like this from the beginning. I'm sorry, Mom." He signed it without argument. My daughter-in-law did not speak to me for approximately 3 weeks after the document was signed. Then, one afternoon in early November, she appeared at my apartment door with my grandson, who had a gap in his front teeth from a recently lost tooth and was extremely proud of it. She said she wanted to talk. I said, "Come in." What she said was not a complete apology. "I want to be accurate about this." She said she had been under a lot of pressure and had said things she hadn't fully meant, and that she hadn't intended for me to hear them, and that she hoped we could move forward. She did not say she was wrong. She did not say she understood what she had nearly done, but she said it sitting in my living room with her hands folded in her lap and her son leaning against her shoulder. And she said it in the voice of someone who was not performing for an audience, who was simply tired and trying. I said I appreciated it. I said I hoped we could move forward too. I meant both of those things. Imperfectly. My grandson showed me the gap in his teeth and told me the tooth fairy had brought him $5, which he considered a low offer, and I told him I thought $5 was a perfectly reasonable offer and that the tooth fairy had a budget to maintain, and he looked at me with great skepticism, and I almost laughed out loud. Here is what I know now that I did not know before that Sunday morning when I walked in through the back door with a pot of soup and heard the shape of how little I was actually valued. I know that love is not the same thing as being available. I had made myself so available, so reliably present and providing, that I had made it easy for the people who loved me least to take me for granted and easy for the person who loved me most, my son, to stop seeing me clearly because I had become furniture, comfortable, useful, always there. I know that stopping is not cruelty. I had believed for years that withholding my help would be a kind of punishment, a weaponizing of love. What I understood that fall, slowly and imperfectly, was that stopping was not punishment. It was simply the truth of the situation, finally made visible. When I stopped, my son had to see what had been hidden by my constant filling in. That was not my cruelty. That was reality, which I had been softening for too long. I know that documentation is not distrust. I spent a long time feeling ashamed about the legal agreement, as if wanting my rights on paper meant I didn't trust my son. What I finally understood is that the people who love you should want you to have protections. If the legal agreement disturbed my son, it was not because it represented distrust. It was because it made something real that had been comfortable as a vagueness. Real things can be addressed. Vague things just accumulate. And I know this. The relationship I have with my son now in the small, particular, imperfect, ongoing form it takes, The baseball games and the Tuesday evening calls, and the way he texted me last week with a photograph of a sunrise he saw on his morning run and wrote, "Just thought you'd like this. That relationship is more real than anything we had in the years when I was writing checks and carrying groceries and making myself indispensable. Because it is not built on what I provide. It is built on who we actually are to each other." My grandson lost his second tooth last week. The tooth fairy, I am informed, brought him $6 this time, which he considers a more competitive offer. He wants to save up for a remote control car. I told him I would match whatever he saves on his own, and he looked at me with the electric-focused attention of a child who has just discovered the concept of investment returns, and I thought, there it is. There is exactly where I want to put my energy. Right here. This boy and his gap-toothed grin and his developing understanding that what you build yourself means more than what you're handed. I am 64 years old. I have a small apartment with good light and a kettle that I chose myself and books, stacked on every surface, and a friend named Cecilia who tells me hard truths on her couch, and a son who texts me sunrise photographs, and a grandson who is learning, slowly, the value of things you earn. I am not finished. I am not rescued. I am not living in a tidy ending where everything was resolved and everyone said exactly what they should have said. I am living in the real version, which is messier and more uncertain and, I think, far better than the version where I kept standing in the hallway with my soup and my groceries, waiting for someone to open the door. I chose to open it myself. That was the only choice that was ever actually mine to make.